You're not invited. Fine. I cut off the funds, exposed the scheme, and issued a hard ultimatum. When social services showed up, they knew my counterattack was real. When my son Michael called me last Tuesday and said those 5 words that would change everything between us forever, I thought I'd misheard him. Dad, you're not invited to Christmas dinner this year. Just like that. 28 years of being his father, reduced to a polite rejection, like I was some distant acquaintance he'd rather avoid during the holidays. But here's what Michael didn't know when he delivered that crushing blow. He had no idea that his old man had been quietly documenting everything for months. Every conversation, every slight, every moment when I'd been treated like a burden instead of the patriarch who'd sacrificed everything for his ungrateful family. And what happened next? Well, let's just say that by New Year's Eve, my son learned exactly what happens when you bite the hand that's been feeding you for 3 decades. Before we dive into this story that'll make your blood boil and your heart race, let me paint you a picture of just how deep this betrayal goes. Because this isn't just about a missed Christmas dinner. This is about a father who gave everything, only to discover that his own flesh and blood saw him as nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed and eventually discarded. I'm Robert Chen, and for the past 5 years since my wife Linda passed away, I've been the kind of father most kids only dream about having. When Michael and his wife Sarah needed a down payment for their dream house, who do you think wrote that check for $47,000? When their second child was born and Sarah wanted to stay home instead of going back to work, who covered their mortgage payments for 8 months straight? When Michael's startup failed and they were drowning in debt, who refinanced his own home to bail them out? That's right, dear old Dad. The same dad who apparently wasn't good enough to share Christmas ham with their new circle of sophisticated friends. But this story gets so much more twisted than you could possibly imagine. See, what I discovered in the weeks leading up to that phone call was that my exclusion from Christmas wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. It was calculated, planned, discussed in family group chats that I wasn't part of. They'd been systematically erasing me from their lives while still cashing the checks I sent every month. You want to know the real kicker? The reason Michael gave me for not being welcome at Christmas dinner was that Sarah's parents were coming, and they wanted to keep things small and intimate. Small and intimate. 12 people around a table that I'd helped them buy, in a house that I'd helped them afford, eating food that my monthly contributions had made possible. Now, I know what you're thinking. Maybe I'm just a bitter old man who can't accept that his adult children have their own lives. Maybe I should have just swallowed my pride, spent Christmas alone with a frozen dinner, and been grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. That's certainly what they expected me to do. But here's where this story takes a turn that nobody saw coming, especially not Michael and Sarah. Because while they were busy planning their perfect little Christmas celebration without the embarrassing old father figure, I was making plans of my own. Plans that would teach them a lesson about gratitude they'd never forget. See, there's something about being dismissed and disrespected that lights a fire in a man's belly. Especially when that man happens to have built a successful construction business from nothing, knows exactly how money works, and has spent decades learning that sometimes the only way to get respect is to demand it. The morning after Michael's call, I sat in my kitchen with my coffee and my checkbook, looking at 5 years' worth of bank statements. 5 years of automatic transfers, 5 years of emergency loans that were never paid back, 5 years of playing the role of the generous father while being treated like an ATM with inconvenient feelings attached. $2,300 a month in mortgage assistance, $1,500 for their car payments, $800 for the kids' private school tuition, $600 for their health insurance premiums. Not to mention the emergency requests that came every few months. New appliances when their old ones worked just fine. Vacation money because the kids need to see the world. Medical bills that their insurance should have covered, but somehow didn't. I added it up 3 times because I couldn't believe the number staring back at me. $147,000. In 5 years, I'd handed over nearly $150,000 to a son who couldn't even invite me to Christmas dinner. That's when something clicked in my brain. Something cold and calculating that I hadn't felt since my business days when competitors tried to squeeze me out of contracts. They wanted to treat me like I was disposable? Fine. Let's see how disposable I really was. I picked up my phone and started making calls. First to my bank, where I'd been a customer for 32 years. Then to my accountant, who'd been handling my books since Reagan was president. Then to my lawyer, who owed me more favors than he could count from all the construction work I'd done on his properties over the years. By noon that day, every automatic payment to Michael and Sarah had been canceled, every joint account had been frozen, every emergency credit line had been revoked. The safety net I'd spent 5 years weaving underneath their lifestyle had vanished in the span of 3 phone calls. But that was just the beginning. You see, what Michael and Sarah didn't realize was that dear old Dad wasn't just some retired construction worker puttering around his empty house, waiting for scraps of their attention. I was a man who'd built a business empire, who understood leverage, who knew exactly how to apply pressure in all the right places. Their mortgage? Co-signed by me when their credit wasn't good enough to qualify on their own. Their second car loan? Also co-signed, because apparently my son's financial management skills were about as developed as his sense of family loyalty. The line of credit they used for home improvements and vacations, backed by my assets because they'd maxed out every other option. In the construction business, we have a saying, never build on a foundation you don't control. Well, guess who controlled the foundation their entire lifestyle was built on? The first sign that my plan was working came exactly 72 hours after Michael's phone call. My phone rang at 6:30 in the morning, Michael's panicked voice crackling through the speaker. Dad, there's some kind of mistake with our mortgage payment. The bank is saying there's no automatic transfer set up anymore, and they're threatening us with late fees. I took a sip of my coffee, watching the sunrise paint my kitchen walls golden. The same kitchen where I'd hosted them for Sunday dinners every week for 5 years, listening to their problems, writing checks to solve their crises, being the reliable father they could always count on, until I became too embarrassing to include in their Christmas plans. That's strange, son, I said, my voice steady as granite. Maybe you should call them and sort it out. I did call them. They said you canceled all the automatic payments. Why would you do that? The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Why indeed? Maybe because respect is a two-way street, and they'd been treating it like a one-way alley for years. Michael, I said quietly, when you decided I wasn't good enough for your Christmas table, you made a choice about what kind of relationship we have. I'm just adjusting my financial commitments to match that reality. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head as he tried to process what I'd just said. This wasn't the pushover father he'd grown accustomed to. This was someone who'd finally remembered that dignity wasn't negotiable. Dad, you can't be serious. We can't afford the mortgage without your help. You know that. Then I guess you should have thought about that before you uninvited me from Christmas dinner. And that's when Michael said something that revealed exactly how little he understood about the situation he'd created for himself. Something that showed me just how far down the rabbit hole of entitlement he'd fallen. Dad, you're being completely unreasonable. This is about Christmas dinner, not money. You can't just cut us off because we hurt your feelings. Hurt my feelings? Like I was some oversensitive child throwing a tantrum instead of a man who'd been systematically disrespected and taken for granted. Like 5 years of financial sacrifice meant nothing compared to their social comfort. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple conversation. This was going to require a much more comprehensive education about consequences, respect, and what happens when you mistake generosity for weakness. But Michael had no idea what was coming next, because canceling the automatic payments was just step one of a plan that would reshape our entire family dynamic before New Year's Eve arrived. You're absolutely right, Michael, I said, my voice carrying that same tone I used to use with contractors who tried to shortchange me on materials. This isn't about money at all. It's about respect. And since you clearly don't respect me enough to include me in your family celebrations, I figured you probably don't need my financial contributions either. The panic in his voice was immediate and raw. Dad, please, you're overreacting. Sarah just thought it would be easier with her parents there. You know how her mother gets nervous around new people. New people. I'd been part of their lives for 8 years, since the day Michael brought Sarah home from college. I'd walked her down the aisle when her own father was too drunk to stand up straight. I'd held her hand in the hospital when she miscarried their first pregnancy. But apparently, to her mother, I was still just some new person who made her nervous. "Michael, let me ask you something," I said, settling back in my chair. "When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? Not because you needed money, not because you had a crisis to solve, but just to talk to your father." The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Dad, you know we've been busy with the kids and work and everything." That's what I thought. So here's how this is going to work from now on. You want to be adults who make adult decisions about your family gatherings? Congratulations. You also get to make adult decisions about your finances. But Dad, we can't just... You can and you will. I spent 5 years being your personal bank while you treated me like an embarrassing relative you had to tolerate. That arrangement is officially terminated. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Power, control, the satisfaction that comes from finally standing up for yourself after years of being taken for granted. But Michael wasn't done. Over the next week, the calls came like clockwork. First, it was just him, trying to reason with me, apologize, negotiate some kind of compromise. When that didn't work, Sarah got on the phone, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness she used when she wanted something. "Robert, I know you're upset, and I understand why. Maybe we made a mistake about Christmas dinner, but you can't punish the grandchildren because you're angry with us." Punish the grandchildren. That was rich, coming from the woman who'd decided their grandfather wasn't suitable company for the holidays. But I let her talk, let her dig her hole deeper with every manipulative word. "Those kids depend on the stability you provide," she continued. "Their school, their activities, their future college funds. You're not just hurting Michael and me, you're hurting innocent children who love their grandfather." "Sarah," I said when she finally paused for breath, "let me tell you something about those innocent children. They haven't called me once in the past month, not to say hello, not to ask about my day, not to share something they learned in school. The only time I hear from anyone in your family is when you need money. So don't lecture me about hurting the kids when you've already taught them that Grandpa's only value is his wallet." The conversation devolved from there, with Sarah's mask finally slipping as she revealed what she really thought about our arrangement. How I should be grateful to have a family who included me at all. How plenty of men my age were sitting alone in nursing homes with no one who cared about them. How I was being selfish and vindictive over something as trivial as a holiday dinner. Trivial, that's what my feelings meant to them, trivial. By the end of week 2, the real desperation set in. Their mortgage payment was officially late, triggering penalty fees and threatening letters from the bank. The car payments had bounced, putting their credit scores at risk. The private school was asking questions about tuition payments that were suddenly missing. That's when Michael showed up at my door unannounced, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 5 days. Dark circles under his eyes, his usually perfect hair disheveled, wearing the same wrinkled shirt I'd seen him in 3 days earlier. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, pushing past me into my living room without invitation. I watched him pace around the room like a caged animal, taking in the home where he'd grown up, the family photos on the mantel showing happier times when we actually functioned like a real family instead of a business arrangement. "This has gone far enough," he said finally, spinning to face me. "You've made your point. We get it. We should have handled Christmas differently, but you can't just destroy our lives because you're having some kind of midlife crisis." Midlife crisis. At 72 years old. The boy clearly had no idea how ridiculous he sounded, but I let him continue his little speech. "Sarah's barely sleeping. The kids are asking why Grandpa doesn't love them anymore. Our credit is getting destroyed, and we might lose the house, all because you couldn't handle not being invited to one dinner." "One dinner," I repeated slowly. "Michael, sit down." He remained standing, his jaw set in that stubborn expression I remembered from his teenage years when he thought he knew better than everyone else. I said, "Sit down." Something in my voice must have reminded him that he was still in his father's house, because he reluctantly settled onto the couch, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. "Let me tell you what this is really about," I said, settling into my recliner, the same chair where I'd held him as a baby, helped him with homework, listened to his teenage problems about girls and college applications. "This isn't about one dinner. This is about 5 years of being treated like a convenience store that happens to be related to you. I pulled out a manila folder I'd prepared, thick with bank statements and receipts, the physical evidence of my generosity and their ingratitude. Do you know how much money I've given you since your mother died? I asked, opening the folder. Not loaned, given, because you've never paid back a single dollar. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed on the papers in my lap. $147,312, I continued. That's not including the down payment for this house, or the car I bought Sarah when her old one broke down, or the vacation to Disney World that the kids just had to take. Michael's face had gone pale, but I wasn't finished. And in return for this generosity, I got to see my grandchildren maybe once a month, always at your convenience, always when you needed something. I got phone calls that started with "Hi, Dad," and ended with requests for money. I got invited to family events when you needed help setting up or cleaning up, but apparently not when it comes to actually celebrating with the family. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Outside, I could hear kids playing in the street, their laughter a stark contrast to the tension filling my living room. "Dad, I know we should have been more appreciative." "Should have been?" I interrupted. "Michael, 3 weeks ago when I asked if I could take the kids to the zoo on Saturday, what did Sarah tell me?" He looked away, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. "She told me you already had plans, but she'd check the calendar and get back to me. You know what day I'm still waiting for that call?" Michael's shoulders sagged like someone had let all the air out of him. "But when your water heater broke 2 days later, how long did it take for my phone to ring?" 37 minutes. I know because I checked the timestamp on the text message Sarah sent me with pictures of the flooding basement. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd raised my son, where I'd thought I'd spend my golden years being a beloved grandfather instead of a reluctant ATM. You want to know what the final straw was, Michael? It wasn't just being uninvited to Christmas dinner. It was realizing that you'd already made that decision weeks earlier, and nobody bothered to tell me until the last possible moment, like I was some afterthought you'd forgotten to cancel. When I turned back around, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. My son was crying. Not the manipulative tears of someone trying to get their way, but the raw, ugly crying of a man who was finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd lost. And that's when I knew I had him exactly where I needed him to be. Not because I enjoyed seeing my son in pain, but because sometimes pain is the only teacher that gets through to people who've forgotten how to listen. "Dad, please," he whispered, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Tell me how to fix this. I'll do anything." I walked back to my chair, but I didn't sit down. Instead, I stood there looking at this broken man who used to be the little boy I'd taught to ride a bike, to throw a baseball, to stand up for himself when bullies picked on him at school. Somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten those lessons about character and respect. "Michael, do you remember what I used to tell you when you were 10 years old and you'd lie to me about your homework?" He looked up at me, confusion mixing with the tears still streaming down his face. "I used to say that trust is like a glass window. Once it's broken, you can put all the pieces back together, but you'll always see the cracks. Well, son, our window is shattered." The next words that came out of his mouth proved to me that he still didn't understand the depth of what he'd done. Still didn't grasp that this wasn't some negotiation where he could offer concessions and get back to business as usual. "What if we invite you to Christmas dinner? Would that fix things? Sarah's parents can stay at a hotel instead of with us. We'll make room at the table, do all your favorite foods, make it special." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly Michael. Throwing money at a problem, making surface-level changes, completely missing the point. "You think this is about Christmas dinner?" I asked. "Michael, Christmas was 3 weeks away when you called me. 3 weeks. Do you know what I was doing when you uninvited me?" He shook his head, still looking like a lost child despite being 32 years old. "I was at Costco buying ingredients to make your mother's famous green bean casserole, the recipe she spent 15 years perfecting. I'd already bought your kids their Christmas presents. I'd already planned to drive over Christmas morning to watch them open their gifts, to help Sarah in the kitchen, to carve the turkey like I've done every year since your mother died." My voice started to crack, and I had to pause to collect myself. Even now, weeks later, the memory of that shopping trip still hit me like a punch to the gut. I was standing in line with a cart full of food, excited about spending Christmas with my family, and my phone rang. And my own son told me I wasn't welcome. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because my presence would be inconvenient for people I'd never even met. Michael buried his face in his hands. Dad, we didn't think. No, you didn't think. You didn't think about how it would feel to be discarded like an old piece of furniture. You didn't think about the man who spent 5 years rebuilding his life around being useful to his family. You didn't think about anything except your own comfort. I sat down finally, feeling every one of my 72 years settling into my bones. The adrenaline that had been carrying me through the past 2 weeks was starting to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that came from finally saying all the things I'd been holding inside. But here's what really breaks my heart, Michael. It's not the money. It's not even being excluded from Christmas. It's the realization that somewhere along the way, I stopped being your father and became your employee. Someone you kept around because I was useful, not because you loved me. The words hung in the air between us like a judgment that couldn't be appealed. Michael's shoulders were shaking now, and when he looked up at me, his eyes held a desperation I'd never seen before. That's not true, Dad. We do love you. I love you. Do you? I asked quietly. When was the last time you told me that? Not because you needed something, not because you felt guilty, but just because you wanted me to know. The silence stretched so long I thought he might have stopped breathing. I can't remember, he whispered finally. Neither can I. That's when Michael did something that surprised me. Instead of making more excuses or trying to negotiate his way out of the consequences, he slumped forward and put his head in his hands like a man who'd finally accepted defeat. You're right, he said, his voice muffled by his palms. About all of it. We've been terrible to you. I've been terrible to you. And the worst part is, I didn't even realize how bad it had gotten until you pulled the rug out from under us. I waited. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a conversation is let the other person fill the silence. Sarah's been saying things, he continued, still not looking at me. Things about how you're getting older and maybe not as sharp as you used to be. How we need to start making decisions for you instead of letting you make them for yourself. And I just went along with it because it was easier than standing up to her. Now we were getting somewhere. The truth was finally starting to leak out around the edges of all their careful justifications. What kind of decisions, Michael? He lifted his head, and I could see shame written across every line of his face. She thinks you should sell this house, says it's too big for one person, too much maintenance for someone your age. She found this assisted living place about 20 minutes from our house. Nice place, she says. You'd have your own apartment, but there'd be people around to check on you. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about Christmas dinner. This was about control, about removing me from my own life and installing me somewhere more convenient for their management. And where would the money from selling my house go? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Sarah thought maybe we could invest it for you. You know, make sure you're taken care of financially. Make sure there's enough for your care as you get older. Make sure there's enough for your care. The euphemism was almost beautiful in its deception. What he meant was, make sure they had access to my life savings when they needed it. Michael, this house has been paid off for 12 years. Do you know what it's worth? He shook his head, but I could see in his eyes that he had a pretty good idea. $437,000. That's what the assessor valued it at last month, and you and Sarah thought you should be managing that money for me. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know. This conversation about Christmas dinner, this whole crisis they were facing, it was all just the opening move in a larger game they'd been planning to play with my life. Dad, it wasn't like that. We just wanted to make sure you were safe, that you had help if you needed it. Safe from what? I'm 72, not 92. I drive, I cook, I maintain this house, I manage my own finances. What exactly do I need help with? Well, you know, as people get older, their children sometimes decide they're inconvenient and try to warehouse them somewhere out of sight. Is that what you were going to say? Michael's face crumpled again, and I realized that somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd been hoping he would deny it, that he'd be horrified by the suggestion that they'd been planning to manage me like a problem to be solved. But he didn't deny it. He just sat there, looking like a man who'd been caught red-handed and didn't know how to talk his way out of it. How long have you and Sarah been planning this? I asked. It's not like we had some master plan, Dad. It's just, things have been hard financially. And we started talking about the future, about what would happen if you needed more care. And Sarah said it would be better to plan ahead. Plan ahead, another beautiful euphemism for spending my money before I was dead. And the assisted living place just happened to free up money that you could use to solve your financial problems. It's not about the money, he said, but his voice lacked any conviction. Michael, everything about our relationship for the past 5 years has been about money. Every conversation, every visit, every phone call. The only difference is that now you're not even pretending otherwise. I stood up again, walking to the mantel where pictures of our family covered every available surface. Michael, at his high school graduation, his wedding day, the grandkids at various ages and stages of their young lives, a life documented in photographs. But somewhere along the way, the love had leaked out of the reality. You want to know what the real tragedy is here? I asked, picking up a picture of Michael and me from his college graduation day, both of us grinning like we'd conquered the world together. I would have helped you. If you'd come to me like a son talking to his father, if you'd been honest about your problems instead of treating me like a mark to be conned, I would have moved heaven and earth to help you. I set the picture back down and turned to face him. But you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. You didn't respect me enough to include me in decisions about my own life. Instead, you decided to manipulate and manage me like I was some kind of problem to be solved. The weight of what he'd lost was finally starting to hit him. I could see it in the way his whole body seemed to collapse in on itself, like a building with its supports removed. Dad, please, tell me how to fix this. There has to be something I can do. And that's when I said the words that would change everything between us forever. Words that would either save our relationship or destroy it completely. There is something you can do, Michael. But it's going to cost you everything you think you want, and it's going to require you to become the man I raised you to be instead of the man you've chosen to become. He looked up at me with something that might have been hope flickering in his eyes. What is it? I'll do anything. I smiled then, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who'd been underestimated by people who should have known better. First, you're going to call Sarah and tell her that the assisted living conversation is over. Permanently. My house, my money, my life decisions remain exactly that, mine. He nodded frantically, like a man grabbing onto a life preserver. Second, you're going to sit down with your wife and have a very honest conversation about respect, about family, and about what it means to honor the people who've sacrificed for you. Okay, yes, absolutely. And third, I said, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper, you're going to prove to me that I matter to you as more than just a source of emergency funding. How? He asked, and I could hear the genuine desperation in his voice. I walked to my desk and pulled out a piece of paper I'd prepared days earlier when I first started planning how this confrontation would go. Here's how. I handed Michael the paper, watching his eyes scan the contents with growing confusion and something that might have been fear. What is this? He asked, though I could tell from his expression he was already starting to understand. That's a contract, son. A very simple agreement that outlines exactly how our relationship is going to work from now on. Michael's hands were shaking as he read. I'd spent 3 days crafting every word, every clause, every condition. This wasn't just about getting my money back or teaching him a lesson about respect. This was about fundamentally restructuring the power dynamic that had turned me from a beloved father into a convenient ATM. Dad, this says I have to call you every Sunday just to talk. No asking for money, no discussing problems, just to check in. That's right. For 30 minutes minimum. I want to hear about your week, your thoughts, your life, not your crises. His eyes continued scanning down the page. It says I have to include you in all major family decisions, kids' schools, vacation planning, holiday arrangements, everything. Also correct. I'm tired of being informed about my grandchildren's lives instead of being included in them. And this part about family gatherings, I watched his face change as he read that particular section. I'd been especially thorough with those terms. Every birthday, every holiday, every significant family event. Not just invited, Michael, consulted during the planning process, asked what I'd like to contribute, treated like the patriarch of this family instead of some distant relative you occasionally remember exists. Michael set the paper down like it was on fire. Dad, This feels like you're treating our relationship like a business transaction. Isn't that exactly what you and Sarah have been doing for 5 years? The only difference is now the terms are clearly stated instead of you changing them whenever it suits you. I sat back down, watching him struggle with the reality of what I was proposing. For 5 years, they'd had all the power in our relationship. They decided when I was needed, when I was welcome, when I was useful. Now I was taking that power back. What happens if we can't meet these conditions? He asked quietly. Then you'll learn to live without my financial support, permanently. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Michael understood that this wasn't some temporary punishment that would blow over in a few weeks. This was a fundamental restructuring of our entire family dynamic. But Dad, some of these things, Sarah's not going to like having to check with you about everything. Then Sarah has a choice to make. She can learn to treat me with the respect I deserve as your father and the children's grandfather, or she can figure out how to pay for her lifestyle without my help. Michael's phone buzzed, and I watched his face go pale as he read the message. Sarah's at the bank, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They're saying we're in default on the mortgage. She's trying to explain that it's just a temporary mix-up, but they want full payment by Friday or they start foreclosure proceedings. That's not a mix-up, Michael. That's the consequence of taking your father for granted. He looked up at me with panic in his eyes. Dad, we need that mortgage payment. If we lose the house, we lose everything. The kids' schools, our neighborhood, Sarah's going to lose her mind. Then I guess you better decide how much your pride is worth compared to your family's security. I watched him read through the contract again, his desperation warring with his resistance to giving up control. This was the moment of truth. Either he was going to swallow his pride and accept that things had changed permanently, or he was going to let his marriage and his children's stability collapse rather than admit he'd been wrong. The part about financial decisions, he said, pointing to a section near the bottom of the page. It says you want full transparency about our budget, our spending, our debts. That feels invasive. Michael, I've been subsidizing your lifestyle for 5 years without any transparency at all. You've taken nearly $150,000 from me, and I have no idea where most of it went. If you want my continued financial support, I'm going to know exactly how my money is being spent. But Sarah manages our finances. She's not going to want to share all that information. Then Sarah can figure out how to manage your finances without my contributions. Each time he raised an objection, I gave him the same response. This wasn't a negotiation. This was an ultimatum. Accept the new terms or learn to live without the safety net I'd been providing. His phone buzzed again. Then again. I could see Sarah's panic growing with each message, her careful world of financial manipulation starting to crumble now that the foundation had been removed. She says the school called about tuition payments. They're threatening to remove the kids from enrollment if we don't catch up by next week. That's unfortunate, I said, my voice steady as stone. Dad, you can't let your grandchildren suffer because you're angry with us. There it was, the manipulation tactic I'd been waiting for. When all else failed, they always went back to using the children as emotional leverage. Michael, those children have been suffering for years because their parents have been teaching them that love is conditional and that family members are only valuable for what they can provide. I'm not the one putting them at risk here. But if they have to change schools, leave their friends, start over somewhere else, then maybe they'll learn something about consequences that their parents never bothered to teach them. I could see the exact moment when Michael realized I wasn't going to be manipulated by guilt about the grandchildren. His last bargaining chip had just been removed from the table. Dad, please, I'll sign your contract. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't let my kids pay for my mistakes. Michael, your children are going to pay for your mistakes regardless. The question is whether they're going to learn that actions have consequences, or they're going to learn that someone will always bail them out when they make bad choices. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where I'd watched my son grow up, where I'd taught him to ride a bike and throw a football and stand up to bullies. Somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten those lessons about character and integrity. You want to know what your real mistake was? I asked without turning around. It wasn't taking my money. It wasn't even excluding me from Christmas dinner. Your mistake was thinking that I was too old, too lonely, too desperate for your attention to ever stand up for myself. I turned back to face him, and I could see that he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd lost. For 5 years, you and Sarah have operated under the assumption that I needed you more than you needed me, that I was so grateful for scraps of your time and attention that I'd never risk losing them by demanding better treatment. Michael's phone buzzed again, but this time he didn't even look at it. His attention was completely focused on me, like he was seeing his father clearly for the first time in years. But here's what you forgot, son. I raised you. I built a successful business. I survived your mother's death and rebuilt my life from nothing. I'm not some helpless old man who needs to be managed and controlled. I'm the man who taught you everything you know about strength and resilience, and somehow you convinced yourself that I'd forgotten those lessons. The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, I could hear a dog barking, a car door slamming, the normal sounds of a neighborhood going about its business while my family imploded. The contract stays as written, I said finally. Every term, every condition, every requirement. You can sign it and start rebuilding our relationship on terms that actually work, or you can walk away and figure out how to solve your problems without me. Michael picked up the paper again, his hand steadier now, his expression resigned. If I sign this, if we do everything you're asking, will you help us save the house? If you sign that contract and actually honor its terms, I'll consider resuming limited financial assistance. But Michael, this isn't about the money anymore. This is about whether you're capable of being the son and father I raised you to be. He found a pen on my coffee table and signed his name at the bottom of the contract without reading it again. His signature looked shaky, uncertain, but it was there. Now what? He asked. Now you go home and have a very difficult conversation with your wife. You explain that the days of treating your father like an emergency fund are over. You tell her that if she wants my help, she's going to learn to ask for it respectfully, instead of demanding it as her due. Michael folded the contract and put it in his pocket. What if she refuses? What if she says the terms are unreasonable? Then you'll have to decide whether you're married to your wife or to your father's money. Because, Michael, you can't have both anymore. As he stood to leave, I could see the weight of his situation settling on his shoulders. For 5 years, he'd been able to avoid making hard choices because my money had smoothed over every problem. Now he was going to have to choose between his pride and his security, between his wife's demands and his father's respect. Dad, he said as he reached the door, I want you to know that I do love you. I know I haven't shown it, but I do. Then prove it, I said simply. Stop telling me you love me and start showing me. After he left, I sat in my quiet house, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of control over my own life that I'd forgotten was possible. For too long, I'd been living at the mercy of other people's schedules, other people's needs, other people's definitions of what my role in the family should be. Now I was taking that power back. My phone rang 20 minutes later. Sarah's name on the caller ID, and I almost laughed at how predictable this was. Michael had barely had time to drive home, let alone explain the new reality to his wife. Robert, Sarah's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Michael told me about your little contract. I think you should know that I find it completely inappropriate and controlling. Sarah, I find it completely inappropriate that you've been planning to put me in an assisted living facility so you could manage my assets. I guess we both have our opinions about what's appropriate. The silence on the other end told me that Michael had confessed more than just the contract. He told her that I knew about their plans for my future, their discussions about my house, their calculations about my usefulness versus their convenience. Those conversations were just theoretical planning for your welfare, she said finally. We were trying to be responsible about your future care needs. Were you also being responsible when you decided I wasn't suitable company for your parents at Christmas dinner? Another silence, then, that was a mistake. We should have handled that differently. Yes, you should have. But mistakes have consequences, Sarah. And the consequence of treating me like an embarrassment to be hidden away is that you no longer get to make assumptions about my generosity. Robert, we have children to think about. This affects them too. There it was again, the children as emotional blackmail. But I'd been expecting this approach from the moment I decided to cut off their funding. Sarah, let me tell you something about children. They learn more from what they see than from what they're told. and what they've been seeing is their parents treating their grandfather like a servant who should be grateful for whatever attention he receives. I could hear her breathing getting faster, the way it did when she was working up to one of her dramatic outbursts. You're being vindictive and petty. This isn't about respect or family values. This is about an old man who can't accept that his adult children have their own lives. If that's what you choose to believe, then you're going to have a very difficult time meeting the terms of the contract Michael signed. He had no right to sign that contract without discussing it with me first. I'm his wife. And I'm his father, the father who's been subsidizing your marriage for 5 years while you plan to warehouse me in a retirement home. So forgive me if I'm not particularly concerned about your feelings being hurt. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Sarah alternating between threats, guilt trips, and attempts at negotiation. But I'd heard it all before, and I was no longer susceptible to her manipulation tactics. Sarah, I said when she finally paused for breath, you have a choice to make. You can accept that our family dynamic has changed and learn to work within the new parameters, or you can continue trying to control and manipulate everyone around you. But understand this, the days of my funding your lifestyle while you treat me like hired help are permanently over. You're making a huge mistake, Robert. When you're old and sick and need our help, remember this conversation. Remember how you chose money over family. I'm not choosing money over family, Sarah. I'm choosing dignity over being used. There's a difference. After I hung up, I walked through my house, really looking at it for the first time in months. The home I'd built, the space I'd maintained, the life I'd created for myself after Linda's death. It was a good life, a comfortable life, a life I'd been willing to sacrifice for the illusion of family closeness. But illusions are fragile things, and once they're shattered, you can't pretend they were ever real. The next few days were going to test everyone's resolve. Michael and Sarah would have to decide whether their pride was worth more than their financial security. I would have to decide whether I was really prepared to watch my grandchildren suffer the consequences of their parents' choices. But for the first time in 5 years, I was the one making the decisions about my own life. And that felt like the first step toward something that might actually resemble the respect I'd been craving all along. The phone would ring again soon. There would be more tears, more threats, more attempts to make me feel guilty for standing up for myself. But I was ready for all of it now. Because sometimes the only way to save a relationship is to be willing to lose it. And I'd finally found the courage to call their bluff. 3 days after Sarah's phone call, I discovered just how desperate they'd become. I was watering my garden Thursday morning when Mrs. Patterson from next door came over with a concerned expression. Robert, I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but there was a young woman here yesterday asking questions about you. Said she was from some kind of social services agency, checking on elderly residents in the neighborhood. My blood ran cold. Social services. Sarah had escalated beyond tears and manipulation. She was now trying to build a case that I was mentally incompetent, that I needed intervention from outside authorities. What kind of questions? I asked, setting down my watering can. Well, she wanted to know if you seemed confused lately, if you were maintaining your property, if you had family checking on you regularly. I told her you were sharper than men half your age, and that your yard looked better than most in the neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson paused, studying my face. Robert, is everything all right? This woman seemed very interested in your living situation, kept asking if I thought you were safe living alone. I thanked Mrs. Patterson and went inside, my mind racing. This was Sarah's endgame. If she couldn't manipulate me back into compliance, she'd have me declared incompetent and gain control of my assets through legal guardianship. The assisted living facility wasn't just a suggestion anymore, it was Plan B. But Sarah had made a critical error. She'd underestimated a man who'd spent 40 years navigating the bureaucracy of construction permits, city councils, and government agencies. If she wanted to play the legal system against me, she'd picked the wrong opponent. I called my lawyer, Tom Morrison, who'd handled my business affairs for 2 decades. Tom, I need you to prepare some documents for me. Power of attorney revocations, medical directives, asset protection trusts, the whole package. Someone's trying to challenge my competency, and I want everything locked down, tighter than Fort Knox. Robert, that's serious stuff. Who's challenging your competency? My daughter-in-law, and possibly my son, though I hope he's not that far gone yet. Tom was quiet for a moment. I'll need to schedule a comprehensive evaluation with Dr. Williams to document your mental acuity. If someone's building a case against you, we need irrefutable evidence that you're of sound mind and body. Within 48 hours, I had medical documentation proving my competency, legal documents protecting my assets from any guardianship attempts, and a very clear picture of just how far my own family was willing to go to get control of my money. The confrontation came that Saturday. Michael arrived at my door looking haggard, followed by Sarah, who walked in like she owned the place despite not being invited. "Dad, we need to discuss some things," Michael said, avoiding eye contact. "Sarah's been doing research about elderly care, about signs of cognitive decline, and she's concerned about some of your recent decisions." Sarah stepped forward, her voice taking on that false, caring tone she used when she wanted something. "Robert, we've been talking to some professionals about your situation. They think it might be time to consider more structured living arrangements, somewhere with medical oversight." I looked at both of them standing in my living room. The son I'd raised and the woman who'd been systematically poisoning his mind against me for years. "Professionals," I repeated slowly. "You mean the social worker you sent to interrogate my neighbors about my mental state?" Sarah's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating woman underneath. "We're concerned about your welfare, Robert. These recent financial decisions, cutting off support for your own family, it suggests impaired judgment. Or it suggests that I finally got tired of being treated like an ATM by people who don't respect me." Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, maybe we should sit down and talk about this calmly." "We are talking calmly, son. Your wife is accusing me of mental incompetence because I stopped funding her shopping habits. I'd say I'm being remarkably calm given the circumstances." Sarah pulled out a folder, her movements precise and calculated. "Robert, I've documented several incidents that suggest cognitive decline. The time you forgot about our dinner plans last month, the confusion about the grandchildren's school schedules, the repetitive stories about your construction days." I almost laughed. Every incident she'd documented was either a lie or a deliberate misinterpretation of normal behavior. "Isho. Sarah, I didn't forget our dinner plans. You canceled them because your book club meeting ran late. I'm not confused about the children's schedules. I'm excluded from them. And if I repeat stories about my work, it's because that work built the life you've been enjoying for the past 5 years. But she wasn't done. Sarah opened her folder and pulled out bank statements, copies of my own financial records that she had no legal right to possess. These erratic financial decisions, cutting off family support without warning, closing accounts that have been stable for years. This is textbook financial abuse of elderly people, often self-inflicted due to paranoia and confusion. The audacity was breathtaking. She was using my own money management as evidence that I couldn't manage my own money. "Sarah, where did you get copies of my bank statements?" "That's not important. What's important is getting you the help you need before you do something that can't be undone." "It is important, because those are private financial records that you obtained illegally. And the only thing that can't be undone here is the damage you've done to this family with your greed and manipulation." Michael finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, maybe we should just listen to what Sarah's suggesting. There are some really nice places, comfortable apartments with medical staff nearby. You'd have your independence but also security." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw a man who'd been so thoroughly manipulated that he was willing to betray his own father to keep his wife happy. "Michael, let me ask you something. Do you believe I'm mentally incompetent?" He couldn't meet my eyes. "I think maybe you're not seeing things clearly right now. The stress of Mom being gone, the isolation, it can affect judgment." "Then you're a fool, son, and your wife is a criminal." I walked to my desk and pulled out the folder Tom Morrison had prepared for me. Legal documents, medical evaluations, financial records showing years of responsible money management despite Sarah's claims. "Shadi. Here's a comprehensive mental competency evaluation completed 3 days ago by Dr. Williams. Perfect cognitive function. Here's documentation of every financial decision I've made in the past 5 years, all completely rational and legally sound. And here's a copy of the police report I filed yesterday about someone illegally accessing my financial records." Sarah's face went white. "You called the police?" "I called the police, the bank's fraud department, and my attorney. Obtaining someone's financial records without authorization is a felony, Sarah. Did you think I wouldn't notice when my bank called to verify some unusual account activity that someone had been asking about?" Michael looked confused, glancing between his wife and me. "Sarah, what is he talking about?" "She used your name and family connection to convince a new teller at the bank to provide information about my accounts. Unfortunately for her, the bank has security protocols that flagged the request." The room went deadly quiet. I could see Michael processing this information, realizing that his wife had been lying to him about more than just my mental state. "Sarah?" Michael's voice was strained. "Did you actually try to get Dad's bank records?" "I was protecting our family's interests," she said defensively. "Someone needed to document his erratic behavior before he gives away everything to strangers or falls victim to scams. You were building a case to have me declared incompetent so you could control my assets through guardianship. That's not protection, Sarah. That's theft with extra steps." Michael sat down heavily, his face in his hands. "Jesus, Sarah, what have you done? I've been trying to secure our children's future while your father has his breakdown. Someone had to be the adult here." That's when I played my final card. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app, showing them the screen. "Sarah, I've been recording our conversations for the past week. Every threat, every manipulation, every admission that this was about money rather than my welfare, including the part where you discussed putting me somewhere more manageable so you could properly oversee my assets." Her face went from white to gray. Modern phones have excellent audio quality, and every word of her schemes was crystal clear. "You can't record private conversations without consent," she stammered. "Actually, in this state I can. Single-party consent law. And since these recordings document your attempts to defraud an elderly person, they're going straight to the district attorney's office along with my police report." Michael stood up slowly, looking at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time. "Sarah, tell me you weren't really planning to have Dad declared incompetent just to get his money." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Sarah's carefully constructed facade was finally crumbling, and underneath was something ugly and desperate that she could no longer hide. "Michael, you don't understand the financial pressure we're under. Your father's being selfish and vindictive, and someone needs to think about our children's future." "Our children's future?" Michael's voice was rising. "You were planning to steal from my father and have him locked away so you could spend his money on our lifestyle?" It's not stealing if it's family money, and he won't live forever, Michael. We're just talking about managing assets that would eventually come to us anyway." There it was. The truth finally laid bare. I wasn't her father-in-law or even a person with rights and dignity. I was a temporary obstacle standing between her and money she'd already decided belonged to her. Michael looked at me with horror in his eyes. "Dad, I swear I didn't know she was planning any of this. The competency thing, the bank records. I thought she was just worried about your well-being." "Were you worried about my well-being when you uninvited me from Christmas dinner? Were you protecting me when you discussed putting me in assisted living behind my back?" That was different. That was just Sarah's parents being difficult, and the assisted living was just future planning in case you ever needed help. Michael, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. Your wife just told you that she sees me as a bank account with an expiration date. Is that really the woman you want raising your children? The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Michael looked at Sarah, then at me, then at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "I need time to think," he said finally. "This is all happening too fast." "Michael, you don't have time," I said quietly. "Your mortgage payment is due Monday. Your children's school tuition is past due. Your car payments are behind. While you're thinking, your life is falling apart." Sarah stepped toward Michael, her voice taking on that manipulative sweetness again. "Honey, your father is trying to turn you against me. This is exactly the kind of divisive behavior that made us think he needed professional help." But Michael wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at me with something that might have been recognition. "Dad, if I sign your contract, if I agree to all your terms, will you help us save the house? If you sign the contract and actually honor it, I'll consider limited financial assistance. But Michael, the contract isn't just about money. It's about respect inclusion, and treating me like family instead of like hired help. And if Sarah can't accept those terms? I looked at my daughter-in-law, this woman who'd spent years systematically isolating me from my own family while spending my money. Then Sarah will learn what it's like to live without the safety net she's been taking for granted. Sarah's voice turned sharp, desperate. Michael, you can't seriously be considering this. He's trying to control our entire lives, dictate how we raise our children, monitor our finances. This is emotional abuse. No, Sarah, I said calmly. Emotional abuse is excluding someone from family gatherings while taking their money. Emotional abuse is planning to have someone declared incompetent so you can steal their assets. What I'm offering is a relationship based on mutual respect instead of financial exploitation. Michael looked at his wife one more time, and I could see the moment when he finally understood what she really was. Sarah, pack a bag. You're staying at your parents' house until we figure this out. Michael, you can't be serious. I'm your wife. Those are my children. And he's my father. The father who raised me, who paid for my education, who's been supporting our family for 5 years while you plan to rob him blind. Sarah's composure finally shattered completely. Fine. Choose your father over your wife, but don't come crying to me when you realize what you've given up, and don't expect me to make this easy for you. She stormed out of the house, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Michael and I stood in the sudden quiet, the weight of what had just happened settling between us like dust after an explosion. Dad, Michael said quietly, I'm sorry for all of it. I should have seen what she was doing, should have protected you instead of enabling her. Michael, the question isn't whether you should have known better. The question is what you're going to do now that you do know. He looked around my living room, at the family photos showing happier times, at the home I'd built and maintained while his wife plotted to take it away from me. I want to try again. I want to be the son you raised me to be instead of the man I became. Will you give me that chance? I walked to my desk and pulled out a fresh copy of the contract, the same terms that had seemed so unreasonable to him just days earlier. The terms haven't changed, Michael. Every condition, every requirement, every expectation. Can you live with that? He took the contract and signed it without reading it again, his signature firmer this time, more resolved. Now what? He asked. Now you go home and start being a father who teaches his children about character and integrity instead of entitlement and manipulation. You show them what it looks like to honor the people who've sacrificed for you. And the house, the mortgage? I looked at my son, this man who'd finally chosen dignity over convenience, family over finance. I'll make the mortgage payment Monday morning. But Michael, understand this. It's not a gift anymore. It's an investment in the man you're promising to become. As he left that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 5 years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a lonely old man clinging to scraps of attention, but the genuine hope that comes from relationships built on mutual respect instead of financial dependency. The phone would ring again, probably many times. Sarah would fight the divorce, try to claim half of everything including money that had never been hers to begin with. There would be lawyers and court dates and custody battles over children who deserved better than parents who used them as weapons. But I was ready for all of it now. Because sometimes the only way to save a family is to be willing to lose the people who were destroying it from within. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to discover who they really are when the money runs out and only character remains. I walked to my mantel and picked up the photo of Michael and me from his college graduation, both of us grinning like we'd conquered the world together. Maybe we hadn't conquered the world, but we'd survived something that could have destroyed us both. And for the first time in 5 years, that felt like victory enough. If you enjoyed this story of justice served and dignity restored, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of people who refuse to be taken advantage of by their own family. Because sometimes the only way to get respect is to stop accepting anything less. And remember, blood might make you related, but respect is what makes you family.